During the American Civil War, the Union and Confederate governments scrambled to make or acquire as many firearms as possible. This yielded a growth in gun manufacturing that lasted beyond the war and also helped spur dramatic innovations in firearms technology. By the end of the war, most of the guns produced or purchased to fight it were obsolete. The military needed to upgrade its weapons quickly and cheaply. Civilians living on the lawless frontier sought arms for protection and hunting. And so the decades after the war continued to see advances in the gun and the evolution of the firearm. At war's end, the federal government had over 1 million obsolete muzzle-loading rifled muskets. What the military needed were breech loaders, but they had too much sunk into the existing arms. The solution was developed by the Springfield Armory's master armorer, Erskine Allen. Allen created a breech-loading conversion system for the model 1861 Springfield rifle musket. Called a trapdoor, Allen's modification involved cutting away the back of the barrel and replacing the percussion lock with a cam lock breech block. The first models were less sturdy than desired, and improvements would continue over the next several years, culminating in the model 1873 Trapdoor Springfield. One of the most iconic and terrifying guns developed during the Civil War was created with the hope of saving lives. Dr. Richard Gatling invented the first continuous firing gun, the Gatling gun, hoping that its high rate of fire would lead to smaller armies and therefore fewer deaths in war. At any rate, this first machine gun saw limited use during the Civil War. The first Gatling gun was not truly an automatic weapon, as the early model required someone to turn a crank. The crank drove the 6 barrels of the gun through their cycle. Each barrel would fire a single bullet, advance, and eject the spent cartridge. The next cartridge fell into place using a gravity feed reloading system. The barrel continued to rotate through its cycle until it fired again. The use of multiple barrels prevented overheating, despite the high rate of fire, 200 rounds per minute. By 1893, improved brass cartridges and other adaptations had increased the firing rate to over 800 rounds per minute. Because of this, firearms technology required improvements in ammunition, which in turn leads to even further advances in firearms. During the Civil War, most soldiers were still using muzzle-loading rifled muskets. Guns such as the Springfield Model 1861 rifle, the most common firearm among Union soldiers, were loaded through what to modern eyes seems a slow and painstaking process using a paper cartridge. The soldier would bite open a cartridge and pour the powder down the muzzle. The powder was followed by the rest of the cartridge, paper, and conical mini bullets, the paper serving as the wadding. Then he would ram the bullet home with his ramrod. The process was not much changed from 100 years earlier, except for the improved firing system of the percussion caps. But even before the Civil War, developments in ammunition had led to the first metallic cartridges. Rimfire metal cartridges were introduced in the 1840s. The rimfire cartridges contained the priming compound, gunpowder, and bullet. The rim of a rimfire cartridge contained the priming compound and essentially served as a wide percussion cap. When the rim was struck by the gun's firing pin, the primer ignited the gunpowder and the expanding gas propelled the bullet forward. During the Civil War, the breech-loading Henry repeating rifle and 56 by 56 Spencer rifle both used rimfire ammunition. But although they were highly prized by the men who used them, they were still much less common than the muzzle-loading Springfields. The next major advancement in ammunition was a center fire cartridge, first developed by Clement Potet of Paris. As the name implies, in a center fire cartridge, the priming powder is in a small cap in the center of the cartridge, rather than along the rim. The rest of the cartridge is filled with gunpowder, capped by a bullet. Hiram Berdan, who led the Civil War unit known as Berdan's Sharpshooters, patented one design for centerfire cartridges in 1866. In the same year, Edward Boxer of England patented another design. Ironically, the Berdan design eventually became more common in Europe and the Boxer design in America. Both designs of the centerfire system could be used in high-powered guns, unlike the rimfire cartridge, which, by design, must have a thinner metal case. But both types of self-contained metallic cartridges allowed for easier and faster loading and more durable ammunition, making possible the modern era of firearms.
One of the great stories of American firearms development in the 19th century is the story of repeating firearms. Smith & Wesson were certainly the pioneers in this regard when it came to the use of guns with self-contained metallic cartridges. They had Roland White's patent on a bored-through cylinder. That kept the idea of being able to put a self-contained cartridge in a cylinder that you loaded from the breech out of anybody else's hands for 20 years. Smith & Wesson had been working with the volcanic system, which actually had the bullet itself had a hollow base to it, in which the propellant, the black powder, was in the hollow dome of the projectile itself.
Revolvers, that is, small arms with revolving chambers used to fire multiple rounds before reloading, had been around in some form for centuries, going back to a revolving arquebus developed by Hans Stoppler in Nuremberg. A few unique designs followed, but were certainly not common weapons. The first widely used revolvers were developed by Samuel Colt. Colt's revolvers used a single-action trigger system in which pulling the trigger performed the single action of releasing the hammer to strike the primer. Colt's revolvers, like those of other manufacturers, were loaded by pouring black powder into the top of each cylinder, pushing a bullet in on top of the powder, and then loading a percussion cap into the rear of the cylinder. Colt had the opportunity for his company to take the lead in a major innovation in handguns. But, as Colt historian R.L. Wilson has written, Samuel Colt made the major blunder of his professional life in his failure to grasp the potential of the self-contained metallic cartridge. In 1852, Roland White, a Colt employee, developed a loading system that allowed cartridges, not yet metallic cartridges to be loaded into the rear of each cylinder. When White showed the idea to Colt, his boss dismissed it as a novelty. A few years later, White was no longer working for Colt, and in 1855, he patented his idea. And in 1856, he was approached by two gentlemen, Horace Smith and Daniel Wesson. Smith and Wesson had started their own firearms manufacturing business in 1852. The Volcanic Repeating Arms Company produced innovative arms and would eventually transform into another arms producer. But not under Smith and Wesson. They left that company in 1856, leaving it in the hands of a certain Oliver Winchester, to whom we will be returning later. Smith and Wesson then formed a new partnership around manufacturing a revolver that combined two new innovations, the metallic cartridge and Roland White's rear loading cylinders. The result was the Smith & Wesson Model 1. Smith & Wesson offered White a 25-cent royalty on each gun sold, and White agreed to pay any legal fees associated with defending against patent infringements. Unfortunately for White, there were many such infringements, and White spent most of his money in court. But in the end, Smith & Wesson held the patent on their gun's design for 12 years, not ending until 1869. Of course, there was a lot of gun purchasing activity right in the middle of that patent, as the Union, Confederacy, and individuals bought up arms all over the country and in Europe. The Smith & Wesson Model 1 revolver held 7 .22 caliber rimfire cartridges. The gun was quick to shoot and reload, but low on power. As for accuracy, Mark Twain wrote of the Model 1 in his travel book titled Roughing It.
I was armed to the teeth with a pitiful little Smith & Wesson 7-shooter, which carried a ball like a homeopathic pill, and it took the whole 7 to make a dose for an adult. It appeared to me to be a dangerous weapon. It only had one fault. You could not hit anything with it. One of our conductors practiced a while on a cow with it, and as long as she stood still and behaved herself, she was safe. But as soon as she went to moving about, and he got to shooting at other things, she came to grief.
Despite Twain's opinion, thousands of Model 1s were bought by soldiers as personal carry weapons. The Smith & Wesson Army Model 1869, or number 3 revolver, proved itself to be an excellent firearm. The Russian cavalry liked the gun so much that they ordered almost 250,000 of them over the next 5 years. A variation on this gun, including improvements by Major George Schofield, was purchased by the U.S. Ordnance Board. But in general, the Russian order was so large and kept Smith & Wesson so busy that they gave little competition to Colt in the American market. After the war, Colt produced the revolver that is most widely associated with America's Wild West, the Colt Single-Action Army Model 1873. Perhaps better known by such handles as the Colt Peacemaker and the Colt Frontier 6-shooter, this sturdy gun has been called the gun that won the West, a title it shared with the Winchester Model 1873 lever-action rifle. The single-action Army revolver was initially produced as a .45 caliber gun with a 7.5-inch barrel. It was loaded through a hinged gate in the recoil shield behind the cylinder on the right side. A spring-loaded ejector rod could push spent casings back out through the gate. The model was sold as the Peacemaker to the civilian market in various calibers and barrel lengths. The Colt proved popular with lawmen and outlaws alike. The Frontier 6-shooter was a variant of the model manufactured in 44 by 40 Winchester caliber, rather than 45. This allowed ammunition to be shared between the revolver and the Winchester rifle. That rifle was produced by the company that had been started and abandoned by Horace Smith and Daniel Wesson. The Volcanic Repeating Arms Company went bankrupt and was reborn as the New Haven Arms Company in 1857 under Oliver Winchester. New Haven's most famous firearm was the lever-action Henry repeating rifle, which was used by a number of Union units during the Civil War. After the war, Winchester reorganized the company again, this time as the Winchester Repeating Arms Company. The first Winchester rifle, the model 1866, was a redesigned and modified version of the Henry. It fired 44 caliber rimfire cartridges with an improved magazine and a loading gate designed by Nelson King. And a few years later, Winchester produced their famous Model 1873. The Model 1873 became so popular that Colt produced a version of its single-action Army revolver in the Winchester's 44 by 44 caliber, allowing men to carry each of these guns that won the West and to share ammunition between them.
If you say that the Colt Peacemaker is the handgun that won the West, certainly the rifle that won the West is the 1873 Winchester. Again, it's the lever action that's almost iconic with the Old West. Although where it differs from the 73 single action and in popular culture is that it doesn't show up in movies with the near regularity and frequency that the single action Army does. And that basically is because of the type of cartridge it was originally chambered in. Originally, these self-contained metallic cartridges were rim fires. It took a while for center fire cartridges to make their appearance. And when they did, they were of 44 caliber center fire cartridges, basically an evolution of the old 44 Henry or rimfire cartridges. The 73 Winchester was a well-regarded gun. It was made well into the 20th century by Winchester. It was a very popular lever action.
As important as the Colt single-action Army, the Smith & Wesson Schofield revolver, and the Winchester 1873 rifle were to the men and women on the American frontier, there were just a few of the many, many guns carried in late 19th century America. The Sharps Rifle Manufacturing Company continued making well-regarded rifles and carbines as it had during the Civil War. The Remington Arms Company produced rifles and revolvers that competed with Colt and Smith & Wesson, such as the Remington Model 1858 revolver. Remington also produced a single-shot cane gun for those who might not want to advertise their arms. The Marlin's Firearms Company, founded by former Colt employee John Marlin, produced single-shot rifles as well as pocket pistols, small caliber, smaller frame guns that were popular for their light weight and easy concealment. Speaking of concealment, there were also a tremendous variety of derringers, like the single-shot model used by John Wilkes Booth to assassinate President Lincoln. And gun makers seemed to produce endless variations on gun models, such as different calibers, barrel length, and aesthetic enhancements, such as pearl handles and intricate engraving. And of course, there were the shotguns. Requiring significantly less skill than a revolver, shotguns were popular for personal protection on the western frontier. Not simply protection, of course. Doc Holliday carried a 10-gauge shotgun to the infamous gunfight at the OK Corral, where he shot Tom McLaury in the chest at point-blank range. The famed gunfighters of the West were identified with a variety of guns. Jesse James' favorite sidearm was a .45 caliber Smith & Wesson Schofield revolver. His brother Frank preferred Remington's 44x40 Frontier revolver. Billy the Kid was pictured with a Winchester model 1873 44x40 rifle and carried a 41 caliber Colt Thunderer revolver. Pat Garrett killed him with a 45 caliber Colt single-action Army. Buffalo Bill Cody carried a Colt Model 1851, and John Wesley Hardin a Smith & Wesson Model 3. The Colt single-action was carried by men on both sides of the gunfight at the OK Corral. The McLaury brothers also had Winchester 1873 rifles, but they didn't reach them in time to use them. And another firearm model, 1873, can also make a claim for being the gun that won the West. The Springfield Armory produced the Model 1873 Trapdoor Springfield, the first standard-issued breech-loading rifle adopted by the United States Army. The Ordnance Department selected the Springfield as the standard arm for the U.S. Army after testing it against almost 100 other models. Although its competitors included repeating rifles like the Henry and the Winchester, the Springfield was selected for its reliability and durability. Both the rifle and carbine version were widely used by the Army in its battles against American Indians.
This is an infantry version of the Model 1873. This was first introduced as a Allen conversion, the very first model in 1866, where they actually took surplus Civil War weapons and converted them to this breech-loading system. This particular rifle, when they were designing it, went through about 5 different patterns until they got to the Model 1873 that we see here. It works quite simply. You cock the hammer and use this toggle to flip up the breech mechanism. The Model 1873 was an advancement. It takes a single cartridge in the breech mechanism here, and then you simply close it. This was nicknamed the trapdoor because the breech mechanism opens and closes much like the way a trapdoor would. The rod here is a holdover from the old ramrods used in Civil War rifle muskets, but this in fact is used as a cleaning rod. Breech loader was considered the best option after the Civil War because it was obvious that the muzzleloader had reached its zenith with the 1863 Springfield. Breech loader is much easier to use, of course, on horseback because you're not fumbling about trying to load cartridge down the muzzle.
In 1876, a Union Civil War hero would lead 5 companies of the 7th Cavalry carrying carbine versions of the 1873 Springfield, as well as Colt single-action model 1873 revolvers, into disaster. Lieutenant Colonel George A. Custer and his men were overwhelmed by a combined force of Lakota and Cheyenne Indians on June 25, 1876, the Battle of Little Bighorn. The American Indians carried a much wider variety of arms. Modern archaeological investigation determined that the thousands of cartridges, cases, and bullets recovered from the battlefield came from 47 different types of firearms. Survivors of the battle reported the Lakota and Cheyenne were using Winchester repeating rifles. There was also evidence that they were firing Sharps, Henrys, Remingtons, Smith & Wessons, Maynards, Ballards, Spencers, Springfields, Colts, Enfields, and more, as well as the traditional bow and arrow. These guns would have been captured on previous battlefields or acquired in trade. The Army continued to use the Springfield 1873 until it was replaced in 1892 as the main service rifle of the U.S. military. A competition was held that year, comparing over 40 different rifle designs. Unlike 1873, when the U.S. Army's own design took the competition in 1892, all the finalists were foreign arms manufacturers. European gunsmiths had developed a new bolt-action design to load a rifle. The first bolt-action gun was the Drese needle gun, invented by Johann Nicholas von Drese of Germany in 1836. In the 1860s, German gunsmiths Peter and Wilhelm Mauser improved upon Drese's design. Their Mauser Model 1871, or Gewehr 71, was adopted by the Prussian Army, replacing the Drese needle gun. The bolt action was a breech-loading design completely different from the vertically sliding breech block created by Christian Sharps in the U.S. in his famous Sharps rifles and carbines. With the bolt-action system, a handle, typically on the right side of the weapon, is used to unlock the bolt, opening the breech cover. One of the Mauser's innovations was that when the bolt opened, it automatically ejected the empty cartridge. A new cartridge is then pushed into the chamber, and the bolt handle is racked forward, closing the bolt. The Mauser 1871 fired a black powder 11 by 60 millimeter round. The Mausers were among the foreign gun designers competing to provide the design for the new U.S. Army service rifle, but they did not make the final cut. The selected rifle was the Krag-Jorgensen repeating bolt-action rifle. It had a lower rate of fire than some of its competition, but ordnance officials, in an echo of their resistance to the Henry rifle during the Civil War, believed that the slower reloading speed was a good thing, as it would preserve ammunition. After the rifle design was selected, the Springfield Armory began production. Eventually, between 1894 and 1904, about 500,000 Krags were produced. They were chambered for the Army's new 30 caliber smokeless powder cartridge.
At the time, they were actually looking at over 40 different weapons designs, and they settled on this Norwegian design that actually caused some consternation with some of the other weapons designers, namely a company of Russell and Livermore actually filed a formal complaint against the U.S. government for adopting this Norwegian rifle. But it is a beautifully crafted weapon. It operates like a standard bolt action. With each shot, you manually operate the bolt. This rifle was considered obsolete at the time it entered production as an afterthought, because it was largely outclassed by the Spanish 7mm Mauser, which was so rapid fire because, unlike the Krag, the Spanish Mauser you could load with a charger clip or a stripper clip of 5 rounds in an internal box magazine. That sped up the loading process, and anything that could make the soldier fire that much more rapidly was always sought after. So this was a very short-lived design. It only served about 9 years in the U.S. Army. And it has this strange box magazine on the side that you can use to top off individual cartridges with, but it closes quite simply with a spring-loaded mechanism.
The Krag was the service rifle of the U.S. Army during the Spanish-American War in 1898. By that point, dozens of manufacturing changes had already been made to the original 1892 Krag design, and so a new model, 1896, had been developed. Meanwhile, the U.S. Marines were using the Lee Model 1895, a straight-pull, cam-action magazine rifle firing a 6mm smokeless cartridge. The short war also saw the first use of the Gatling gun by the U.S. Army for mobile fire support for offensive combat during the famous battle for San Juan Hill. The Gatling guns used at that time had 10 rotating barrels and could fire from 300 to 900 shots per minute, using the same ammunition as the Krags. First Lieutenant John Henry Parker led the Army's newly formed Gatling detachment. At one point, Parker's guns blazed in support of Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders. Parker wrote in his History of the Gatling Detachment,
Traub pointed out the enemy, which was menacing Colonel Roosevelt's position. About 600 yards to the right, oblique from the position of guns and perhaps 200 yards, or less, in front of the salient occupied by Colonel Roosevelt and the 3rd Cavalry, there was a group of about 400 of the enemy, apparently endeavoring to charge the position. Sergeant Green's gun was instantly turned upon this group at point-blank elevation. The group melted away. Captain Marcotti states that after the surrender, some Spanish officers described this to him, stating that the enemy seen at this point was a body of about 600 escaping from El Caney, that they were struck at this point by machine gun fire so effectively that only 40 of them ever got back to Santiago. The rest were killed.
Roosevelt was so impressed with Parker's actions that day and his ability to see the potential of the machine guns that he put his 2 Colt 7mm machine guns under Parker's command. Parker later wrote that the guns
had 4,000 rounds of 7mm ammunition. 4,000 was not a very large supply for 2 guns which could fire at the rate of 500 shots each per minute. Fortunately, the Gatling gun detachment had found time, on the 1st of July, to collect about 10,000 rounds of Mauser ammunition in the captured trenches, and a comparison of the Mauser with the 7mm ammunition at once disclosed the fact that it was precisely the same ammunition.
Roosevelt's unit of volunteers were using carbine versions of the Krag. The regular U.S. Army units also carried Krags, but volunteer units that didn't happen to be led by a former Assistant Secretary of the Navy were given old 45-70 black powder Trapdoor Springfields, as not enough of the Krag models had been produced by 1898. The Americans faced Spanish soldiers carrying the Mauser model 1893 rifle. Called the Spanish Mauser, this rifle was certainly superior to the Trapdoor Springfields carried by most volunteers. Using this rifle, 750 Spanish regulars held off 15,000 U.S. troops carrying Krags and Trapdoors. The 93 had a longer effective range than the Krag, and American soldiers quickly realized that the Krag's lower rate of fire wasn't the blessing that ordnance officials had believed. The 93 had a speed-loading stripper clip versus the Krag's 1 bullet at a time loading. The U.S. respected the 93 and saw the need to upgrade its firearms. The Krag suffered from its slow-loading magazine. It was also unable to handle high-velocity cartridges. The 1903 Springfield bolt action was derived from studies of the many Spanish Mauser rifles that were captured during the Spanish-American War. Eventually, the U.S. government was sued by Mauser and paid royalties for the use of the design.
The 03 Springfield, when paired against the Mauser, they operate virtually the same. The ammunition for the 03 Springfield was updated in that they adopted a rounded boat tail bullet based upon what the Germans had developed for their 7.92 by 57 millimeter cartridge. It is different than the Mauser rifle that the Germans were armed with in World War I, the G98, in that it is short. This has only a 24-inch barrel. That's because at the time it was developed in 1903, this was intended to replace both the infantry weapon and the cavalry weapon, because there was a tendency to adopt a shorter carbine for both infantry and cavalry use.
The decades following the Civil War saw an explosion of arms across the country as manufacturers such as Colt, Smith & Wesson, Winchester, Remington, and more developed the revolvers and rifles that would define the era. The Frontier model of the Colt single-action revolver and the Winchester model 1873 rifle served together, providing the frontiersman with a rugged sidearm and long arm that could share ammunition and be relied upon in a fight. The military continued its search for the perfect rifle, finally copying the Mauser design that had been used to good effect by enemy soldiers. The development of the 1903 Springfield was good timing for the U.S. By the time America entered into World War I, almost 850,000 of these guns had been produced by the Springfield Armory. Like all major wars, World War I would lead to advances in firearm technology as nations poured their resources into developing the perfect weapon. The machine gun, which served so well on San Juan Hill, would become a terrible force in the trenches of Europe. Another chapter in the story of the American gun.